Big 12 power rankings, plus transfer news and spring practice notes from across college football after the stinger. Hello and welcome to episode 38 of Good Morning College Football. I am Nicholas Ian Allen of CFB Winning Edge and CampusToCanton.com. Thank you for joining us on this Friday morning. I don't know about you, but I am ready for the weekend. But before we get to that, we've got quite a bit to discuss. We've got some Big 12 conference power rankings from our CFB Winning Edge team profiles, which will be available to our C2C Winning Edge and all 22 tier members at CampusToCanton.com in roughly 3 weeks. Got about 3 weeks to go. We're going to publish those in the second week of May. Trying to nail down the official date, but somewhere between the 8th and the 10th is likely to be when you will see those. It's kind of difficult to predict if you followed along with us in the past. If you were a past member of CFB Winning Edge on Patreon, it was always kind of tough to nail down that official published date for the team profiles. It all kind of comes together very quickly at the end. And we try to make those available as soon as they're at all useful to our subscribers. So in those early days, there probably will be some rough edges, but we do try our very best to wrap those up, get them as good as they can possibly be, and present them to our members as soon as possible so that you can look through them, have them available, our projected depth charts for all 134 FBS teams, plus we're going to throw Delaware into the mix as well. New FBS team in 2025, but we'll go ahead and try to get them available a year early. And then projected point spreads in 3 different models for every game, FBS versus FBS and FCS opponents as well. But all of our ratings and rankings, player ratings, coach ratings, team performance, all that good stuff will be available in early May. But as we have gone through and sort of completed every team in a particular conference, we wanted to walk through our power rankings for that individual league. And the Big 12 is up for us today. But before we dig into that, I mentioned what you can get as part of the C2C Winning Edge and all 22 tier packages at CampusToCanton.com. Also, with that, you would get access to our returning production database, something we talk about a lot here on the show. That includes team pages for all 134 FBS teams that tell you who's coming back, who's not, who's graduated, who's moving on to the NFL, who is transferred out, who is transferred in, as long as they were responsible, as long as they recorded some sort of statistic in the 2023 season. Those players are listed. And as you know, even though there's not been a ton of, just super headline players entering the transfer portal so far during this spring window, there have been a lot of players, hundreds at this point. So we've been trying to keep track of those moves as well as we possibly can, making updates several times throughout the course of the day. So if you want to see how those transfers impact the number of players coming back, the level of production coming back, do check us out at CampusToCanton.com at those levels. And if you want to try a lower tier, you can subscribe for as little as $2.99 per month, get access to a wide range of tools and content, ADP rankings for CFF, C2C, Devi, all kinds of information there available to all of our subscribers, as well as Discord access, where you can ask questions, interact with other members and contributors and the founders of Campus to Canton as well. And finally, on that note, Thank you very much to those of you who are tuning in to us live, wherever you are doing that. If you haven't already, we very much would appreciate you giving this video a like on the Campus to Canton YouTube channel, as well as subscribing to that channel. Helps really keep this show going, quite honestly, but also helps support Campus to Canton as a whole. And we really, really do appreciate your support with that. Now, moving on to our Big 12 power rankings. And I tweeted a little bit about this last week because I had an indication on where this was going. And I first of all, if this is your first time joining us, or if this hasn't been clear any other time that you might have tuned in to Good Morning College Football, you should sort of be under the assumption that I know nothing. So I have access to all the sheets that we put together for the C2C Winning Edge tier. Usually I am referencing those sheets. My long-term and short-term memory have just really I don't know, they're not as good as they once were, and I feel like I know less about college football every day. I just have access to some pretty good information, able to collect information from a variety of sources and put it into the work that we do here and the work that we do in our team sheets. But as of right now, just because there's so much information going in and out for me every day, whether it's the transfer news, all these spring reports we talk about, and just going through team websites and participation charts and depth charts and the statistics, all that good stuff. I feel like I'm not really retaining too much personally. I haven't been involved really in any CFF drafts this year. That in the past few years has been sort of my lifeline as to, okay, what do I actually think about some of these players? And so I haven't really developed much as far as a personal opinion about particular players and really about particular teams. But the Big 12 maybe takes that to a whole new level because just there's so much changing, right? The teams like Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, Utah joining the Big 12, really mixing things up. Also, the teams that joined from the Group of Five last year, UCF, Cincinnati, BYU. So this is a much, much different league than it was just 2 years ago. And also seeing how the numbers shake out as far as our roster strength ratings. That's a the single biggest piece of the calculation of our overall power rankings, or how are these rosters constructed based on recruiting information adjusted for experience and production. So each individual player gets a player rating based on those three things. We add all those player ratings into the mix to help us develop position and unit ratings, and then use those to develop offense and defensive roster strength ratings, combine those to give our overall roster strength ratings, throw that into the mix with our coach ratings, team performance, and that gives us our overall power rating. It has nothing to do with my opinion. It is all just based on what do the numbers tell us, based on how this roster is constructed, how the team performed on the field last year, and how this head coach's teams have performed in the past. So sometimes that gives us some really, really unexpected results, and the Big 12 are definitely that's definitely the case here. And I tweeted about this a little bit last week. Long ramble to get to this point. UCF right now is our highest rated Big 12 team in our CFB Winning Edge team strength power rankings. Now, if I were to write what is my opinion, how do I expect these teams to stack up, just based on what I've seen in the past, how well these teams have played, sort of my own personal understanding of what's coming back and what's not, I would not have UCF probably anywhere near number one. They would probably be middle of the pack for me. And I was curious to see how this, stacked up against some of the other really, really great models, including sort of the gold standard, right, is SP Plus. Bill Connolly, what he has now at ESPN, he's got UCF in the back half of the Big 12. And again, that's not his opinion. That's just sort of the way that he, has developed his own system. We do things similar in some ways. We do things very different in some ways. And this obviously gave us two very different results, because right now UCF is a top 25 team in our power rankings, number one in the Big 12, obviously. In SP Plus, and this is the most recent rankings I saw were dated February 14th. So if I've missed some sort of update, my apologies. But UCF in that rating was 59th. They were 10th in the Big 12. Utah, Kansas State, Arizona, and Oklahoma State were all top 20 teams in that SP Plus ranking. No teams are in our Big 12 no teams are in our overall top 20 right now in our team strength rankings. UCF right now is 21st. They lead the pack. And it's a bit of a surprise. UCF is a team that we were too high on last year. So I was worried that, that might be the case again, because like I said, we build those individual player ratings based on experience and production, in addition to those recruiting ratings coming out of high school. A team like UCF, which really does lean on a large percentage of transfers, a lot of those players who have either been highly recruited coming out of high school and then end up at UCF after things maybe didn't work out somewhere else, or they also last year, part of the reason that our roster strength ratings look so good for UCF, there were a handful of players, especially on the defensive side of the ball, who transferred in after being standouts at their group of five school. So they would end up coming in with a rating in the high 80s, low 90s, where a lot of that rating was built on just their level of production at a lower level of competition. And sometimes, we do a great job of properly calibrating that. And sometimes, and it seemed like maybe last year with UCF, we didn't. We sort of overrated UCF. And there's, certainly some of those players are back. There's a decent level of returning production, especially on the defensive side of the ball. They're top 50 nationally in defensive returning production, according to our numbers, 71st overall, so roughly FBS average. And then they added some, very talented players, the most important of which is KJ Jefferson, quarterback transfer from Arkansas, who has played in 44 career games, 38 career starts, has been a productive player and, steps in to be the starting quarterback at UCF. So that really solidifies that position. There's not going to be a drop off, at least the way that we calculate it. Moving on from John Rice Plumlee, who is preparing for a professional career. KJ Jefferson comes in and looks like, a top 15 starter as far as our individual player ratings at that position go. RJ Harvey at running back, I believe is, if not a first round pick in CFF drafts, on the fringe there, certainly a top 2 round type player based on his level of production last season. Might get hurt a little bit because KJ Jefferson does run the football quite a bit, especially down by the goal line, and at 250 plus pounds, listed at 242, but seems like perhaps he's a little upward of 250 based on some most recent information. He's a very powerful runner that could end up taking a few touchdowns away from RJ Harvey. But regardless, Harvey, one of the best running backs in the country. And there's some good wide receivers as well. I have high expectations for Kobe Hudson this year. He's been a little bit banged up this spring. But Xavier Townsend stepping up. Looks like he is going to be one of those top 2 wideouts as well. Should be able to provide some quality weapons for KJ Jefferson. The quarterback position did take a little bit of a hit in its depth this week with backup Timmy McClain entering the transfer portal, perhaps looking for an opportunity to start elsewhere. But UCF ranks top 25 nationally right now in our roster strength ratings, both overall, on offense, and on defense. So I'm quite nervous about this. I'm fully expecting that we're going to end up looking pretty silly that UCF is a top 25 type team and the top rated team right now in our preseason power ratings. But sometimes things work out. We have a pretty good process, I think, for how we evaluate these teams. Again, opinion is no part of that calculation, and so sometimes the numbers end up working themselves out, and maybe show a little value on a team related to some other folks out there, some other systems, some other ratings outfits. So I'm not sure. I have personally no opinion to say that we are right that UCF is the best team in the Big 12 on paper. They did, play at a top 40 level last year, ranked 36th in our overall team performance. We're a top 10 offense in team performance last season, and I don't see a significant drop-off, even with a change at quarterback, losing top wide receiver as well. 2 full-time starters coming back on the offensive line. The defense needs to take a big step forward. They were 88th last year in defensive team performance, but this is a wide open conference, and UCF absolutely could be in the mix. Now, again, my personal opinion, I probably would put Utah as the number 1 team in my personal Big Ten power rankings, and they're close. They're close to UCF. They are a top 25 team as well as it stands right now. They're number 2 in our Big 12 power rankings. They also have a top 25 roster strength, both offensively and defensively and overall. The biggest news, the biggest piece of that puzzle is Cam Rising, a quarterback, back and fully healthy. We've talked about that a good bit this spring. Getting Brant Keefe back at tight end is, of course, excellent. Adding some weapons like Dorian Singer through the transfer portal. Utah also just got a commitment from Damian Alford, who's a starter at Syracuse, to help boost that wide receiver group as well. According to everything I read, including a most recent post-spring projected depth chart from the Deseret News, Micah Bernard seems like the number 1 running back, and all indications are he'll be that first guy on the field this fall. But Jalen Glover in the mix as well, should get plenty of opportunities, as well as Anthony Woods, transfer from Idaho. But this Utah offense looks really, really good, and defensively, Utah consistently performs at a high level. So I expect that the offense, which ranked 95th last year in overall offensive team performance, they're going to take a big step forward, probably a top 50 unit, I would expect. If they do that and continue to play like a top 30 defense like they did last season, this Utah team is going to be very, very difficult to beat in the new look Big 12. Oklahoma State and Kansas are going to be there also. Those 2 teams rank right around top 30 nationally in our Big 12 power rankings. And that's something that we're going to, discuss a little bit here. It's going to be sort of a theme. There are not very many breaks in tiers. There's not a wide range between these teams. Right now, UCF is 21st for us. Kansas is 30th. So, 4 teams in that 20 to 30 range, all of them could be conference title contenders. And then when we get to tier 2, we're talking about an even larger group that is, top 50 to mid 50s. But Oklahoma State with, arguably the best running back in college football in Ollie Gordon, Ashton Jeanty at Boise State, certainly in that conversation, but Gordon came on, had a huge season last year after a little bit of a slow start. We've talked before about the level of experience returning for Oklahoma State on the offensive line, which as a unit didn't grade out particularly well last season. The way we calculate it, they were 98th in O-line performance rating, but still expect that running, rushing attack with Gordon leading the way, and that experienced offensive line is going to be very difficult to slow down. Also, the quarterback position, part of the reason Oklahoma State got off to a slow start last year is they were rotating quarterbacks, probably didn't need to. It seemed clear to a lot of folks on the outside that Alan Bowman gave them the best chance to win. Eventually, the coaching staff made that decision as well. That really helped unlock guys like Rashad Owens, who had a huge back half of the season. Looks like a great wideout in the Big 12. Brennan Presley, of course, has been an all-conference performer in the past. Deshaun Stribling at wide receiver, who was injured early last year, getting him back and fully healthy will be big. This Oklahoma State team is so far the most talented team that we've discussed. They're 16th in our overall roster strength ratings, top 10 on the offensive side of the ball, top 25 defensively. They are absolutely going to be in the mix. Kansas is a team that has come a long way in a short while. Defensively, I have some concerns. Looks like right now in our roster strength ratings, Kansas is going to be an FBS average or below defense, but a top 15 offense, especially if Jalen Daniels is back and healthy. We talked about some good news on that front potentially, as they finished spring camp earlier in the week. Devin Neal, one of the top running backs in the country, experience at the wide receiver position as well. Offensive line looks pretty good on paper, probably 2 transfers coming in to start. If the defense, which last year was a little below FBS average, 74th in our defensive team performance numbers, if that unit takes a little bit of a step forward, plays a little better than its talent profile would suggest, then this Kansas team, I think, absolutely can be a factor in the Big 12 title race. Tier 2 is huge. Arizona is a team that was, in some top 10, top 15, way too early preseason rankings. I believe ESPN had them top 10 after last season. A coaching change is going to be a factor. Some transfer defections going to be a little bit of a factor. Multiple starters on the defensive line. At least one starter in the secondary from last year's team have entered the transfer portal. Jonah Coleman, very, very talented running back, has transferred to Washington. So Arizona is a team that has lost a little bit of ground, but seemingly is going to be able to hold on to Takario Davis, who is back on the transfer field, still in the transfer portal, kind of a unique situation, is listed as a top 10 or top 5 available transfer in multiple places. Max Olson, the Athletic, had him, I think, number 2 in a recent write-up. Number 3, I should say, behind Damian Martinez and Dominic Williams, the defensive tackle from TCU. But Davis, after giving fans a little bit of a scare earlier in the week by sitting out of practice, seems like maybe that was more injury related than him really looking to move on. There was a tweet by the Arizona football account of Davis in action on the practice field on Thursday. So that would be huge if they are able to hold on to him. Damian Martinez, the top transfer currently available, the former Oregon State running back, was on campus on Thursday. Seemed to enjoy his visit from what we can gather. That running back group, despite losing Coleman, should be very deep. Quali Conley, who's been a little banged up this spring. Ja'Cory Cruxy Merritt, who has not yet arrived from New Mexico, but had, 18 rushing touchdowns last year. And Rayshawn Luke, Speedy Luke. That running back group, doesn't necessarily need Damian Martinez, but it would definitely add to the offensive firepower for Arizona, which really took a huge step forward last year when Noah Fafita took over as quarterback. Ted McMillan, one of the best, maybe the best wide receiver in college football. And sounds like Montana Lamonius Craig was making some highlight catches earlier in the week as well, an experienced offensive line. So even though the overall roster strength for Arizona right now is, middle of the pack nationally, in part because of some of the losses they suffered on defense, this offensive unit, which right now looks like a top 40 unit on paper, I think we are underrating Arizona. I think them currently being just inside our top 40, I probably should have included them in that top tier because I do think that they will play up to that level. I think they will absolutely be in the mix with an Oklahoma State, with a Kansas. And you could say the same for Kansas State, which we're skipping a few teams here, but want to move a little bit quicker so we don't just run out of time. Kansas State, as I said, is the number 2 Big 12 team in SP+. They are a top 20 team nationally, 18th. Arizona is 19th. So we're probably too low on Kansas State. They are consistently a team that the way we calculate things, which works pretty well for us for the vast majority of teams. We'll talk more of our record as far as against the spread performance and win totals and things like that as we get a little closer to the season. But if you followed along for a while, you probably know a lot of those numbers. But sometimes teams are tricky for us to really get a good read on. Kansas State is one of those. They don't recruit at a particularly high level. So unless they are a highly experienced team, able to add production points to those, individual player ratings over the course of a few years, bring back an experienced squad, we are probably going to be a little bit low on Kansas State. That might work out for us. Maybe everybody who fell in love with Avery Johnson, and believe me, I'm a fan as well. Maybe we're getting a little, too far ahead of ourselves. Perhaps Johnson is a mid 80s player in our individual player ratings. Good, but we do see a drop off a little bit, just based on, it doesn't have a whole lot of experience. Made 2 career starts. DJ Giddens, very, very good running back, but the offense as a whole is quite inexperienced outside of Giddens. Kansas State right now ranks 120th in our overall returning production numbers. If Avery Johnson comes in and is as better, as good of a playmaker as he looked in the bowl game, as good as he looked as a high school recruit, then yeah, Kansas State's probably going to be challenging in that top tier, maybe at a top 20 overall level like SP Plus has. But the way we calculate it, we've got some questions about the offense from an experience standpoint and from a roster strength standpoint. The defense looks a good bit better. They're top 15 in returning production. By my count, looks like 7 full-time returning starters. Everybody else that we've got listed in the projected starting lineup played nearly 30% or more of snaps last season. A couple of transfers coming in to add some depth there as well. So Kansas State and Arizona, we're probably a little too low. They certainly, I think you could make an argument, might be in that tier 1 group of legitimate conference title contenders. But for us, K-State is, top 50 or so nationally. We'll run through the rest here. West Virginia, huge, exceeded expectations last year. Garrett Green at quarterback, a ton to build around there. TCU, of course, slid after making the national championship game in the 2022 season. I expect a little bit of a bounce back after TCU falling short of a bowl bid last year, but we mentioned the loss of Williams. That's huge. Literally, he is going to be one of the most highly sought-after players in the transfer portal, certainly at a position of need for just about everybody. So big loss there. Texas Tech, I think is going to be a dangerous team. Really a little bit concerned about Baron Morton's health, but Taj Brooks at running back took on a much heavier workload last year than expected, and Texas Tech was really able to lean on him. If that offense can get going, whether it's leaning on Brooks again or a little more of the pass-happy offense that we expected when Zach Kittley came over as offensive coordinator a few years ago, Texas Tech, again, dangerous team. Iowa State, I think, is in the mix in large part because of returning production. And Iowa State was another team that exceeded expectations last year, especially with a lot of the off-the-field issues that were, in headlines prior to the season. To get to a bowl game, to get a winning record was huge. Can they take the next step forward? Iowa State, similar talent profile to Kansas State. They just aren't going to rank particularly high in our roster strength numbers. But with number one overall returning production, number 1 on the offensive side of the ball, number 3 on the defensive side of the ball, could expect that Iowa State certainly could take another step forward. Colorado always will be a wild card. I was a little bit concerned earlier in the week before a few pretty highly rated transfers, guys like running back Alton McCaskill, tight end Chayton Medier entered the transfer portal. Colorado was inside the top 10 in our overall offensive roster strength. They were knocking on the door of the top 40 nationally, with some thinning out on the defensive side of the ball, guys that we talked about already, a couple of projected offensive starters in our projected depth charts, regardless of, how Coach Prime said maybe those guys weren't in competition to start based on practice at this point. But feel a little bit better about where Colorado is right now. They are just inside the top 60. They do rank quite high in offensive roster strength. They're 14th. A lot of that is Shedeur Sanders as an upper 90s player. The wide receiver position looks good on paper. Jimmy Horn back, Travis Hunter back. Putting Hunter as a starter on both offense and defense is going to help those roster strength numbers, of course. LeJontay Wester, transfer from FAU, ranks really, really highly based on just his eye-popping numbers at the Group of 5 level. Perhaps we're overrating him a little bit, but still think he's going to be a dangerous weapon. And then Colorado is one of those teams kind of similar to UCF, where the roster strength numbers look really good, in part because a lot of the transfers maybe were rated really highly coming out of high school, or if they're coming up from a Group of 5 team or a FCS level, they probably have been very productive. We're able to add some of those production points. So for Colorado, it balances things out because they did not rank high in any team performance numbers last year. They were 93rd overall, 71st on offense, 119th on defense. That really helped offset those high top 25 roster strength numbers. So Colorado, will the Coach Prime experience just blow up spectacularly? Possibly. Would I personally be shocked if things click, especially if Shedeur Sanders stays healthy? Those weapons in the wide receiver room, or they get a little bit of something in terms of rushing offense. And this Colorado team is in a bowl, or maybe making life very difficult for the top half of the Big 12. I would not be shocked. But I'm also, feeling a little bit better that we're not going to be much higher on Colorado than maybe a lot of other folks out there. So that to me was a little bit of good news. We're a little more in line with SP Plus for Colorado. They're 66th there. We have them 58th right now. Baylor is just in time inside the top 70. Think that Baylor will be an improved team. And then there's a pretty clear tier break for teams like Houston, Cincinnati, Arizona State, and BYU, who right now are below FBS average in our expectation, in our power rankings. These are teams that are going to be in the 70s, 80s, and 90s once our final power rankings are done. BYU, just right now on paper, really doesn't look good the way we calculate it. I think they'll be a little bit better than our numbers indicate. I think Arizona State, despite the big transfer news that Jaden Rashada is entering the transfer portal, the team at C2C loves Sam Leavitt. Doesn't sound like Leavitt, the transfer from Michigan State, has been taking a lot of first-time reps so far this spring. But even if Trenton Bourgo gets that starting nod, then, in week 1 or 2, perhaps Leavitt will be able to edge him out before the end of the year. Keep an eye on that, because I know our team does love Leavitt, and Arizona State, I personally do expect will take a bit of a step forward this season. There's some, I don't know, there's some positive buzz, and I do think Dillingham, despite being very young and honestly, inexperienced coming into last year, that probably played a little bit into their lack of success. But top 20 in returning production, or actually after the Rashada adjustment, they're outside the top 30, 32nd in our most up-to-date numbers. But good depth at running back with Cam Scatabo. A lot to like in the receiving group. Should have said Raleek Brown, the former 5-star or 4-star running back, USC transfer, who played a little receiver as well before transferring out. He's had a huge spring. So Arizona State, I think we might be a little low on. I think they might have a chance to maybe jump into that tier with Colorado and Baylor. But still a team that just right now, on paper, the way we calculate it, definitely on the low end as far as our power rankings go. All right. So with that said, and with, again, the reminder that I know probably nothing about how this Big 12 will shake out. These rankings didn't necessarily line up with my own personal opinion, and they will change because, of course, the transfer portal is still open. Things will be adjusted both positively and negatively, based on that, based on any injuries that we hear. So we'll get back into power rankings for conferences and team previews a little later, closer to the season, but that's how things stack up right now in the Big 12. As for transfer portal updates, we touched on a lot of those notes, and a lot of Big 12 teams were impacted by the recent news. We mentioned Damian Martinez's visit to Arizona. He, according to multiple reports, I think Hayes Fawcett of On3 was among the first I saw to list that Mississippi State, Kentucky, and Miami are reportedly getting visits from Martinez. I think there was an in-home visit with Martinez in Miami. Maybe earlier this week, there was some reporting to that nature. Apparently, a previously planned visit to Tennessee was canceled. So if Martinez doesn't end up in Tucson, sounds like perhaps he is looking east, either to the SEC or Miami. Still seems like a pretty, maybe the betting favorite if you were to describe it as such. Justin Spears of the Arizona Daily Star and Tucson.com reported on Martinez being at practice on Thursday. He stood on the sidelines next to San Jose State transfer running back Wally Conley, who he said was out due to injury. He's been dealing with a right leg injury, according to Spears, and then mentioned that Takario Davis, one of the top corners in the Big 12, quite honestly, but certainly in the transfer portal, one of the top players currently in the transfer portal, was back at practice. A few others who had sat out earlier in the week were back as well, including wide receiver AJ Jones and linebacker Jacob Manu. And then finally, before we get to more just transfer notes, finishing up from the Arizona practice, wide receiver Jackson Holman, according to Spears, Jackson Holman, sorry, voice did something weird there, has been a, quote, standout pass catcher this spring. So 6'4", 205-pounder. It was called a, quote, technician in running routes and seldomly drops passes. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about who potentially could complement Ted McMillan in that passing attack. We mentioned Williams, the transfer now from the interior defensive lineman at TCU. He is going to be a highly sought after player. In Max Olson's top 10 available transfers from The Athletic, there was also listed former Texas A&M safety Jacoby Matthews, Penn State wide receiver Keandre Lambert, Jason Zandamela from USC, the offensive lineman, a couple of offensive linemen, most recently of SMU, Marcus Bryant and Branson Hickman, and then a couple of recent transfer additions, Penny Boone, the running back, last season at Toledo, this spring at Louisville, and Kent State defensive lineman CJ West, who we talked about before. A few names that perhaps could break into a top 10 at some point, or certainly top 25 caliber transfers, most likely. Simeon Barrow of Michigan State, an interior defensive lineman, has entered the transfer portal. Again, he briefly spent some time in the portal last season. He is looking for a new home, and again, interior defensive line is probably number one on just about everybody's wish list. Barrow is, I think, already been linked to LSU, among others. We've talked about LSU this spring is really having a need there. So keep that in mind. A lot of SEC teams, it sounds like, are going to be in the mix for guys like Barrow and West and Williams. Any others that may pop up, I'm sure. One out of Louisville, Jermaine Lowell, we mentioned earlier in the week. And on that note, at Louisville, we discussed on the same day we talked about Lowell entering the transfer portal that there were 4 offensive linemen who were reportedly entering, including Lance Robinson and Trevante Sylvester, which we learned this week apparently is not the case. Those 2 are returning to Louisville. Brandon Marcello had a note about rescinding his initial report on Sylvester and Robinson. But later on, Louisville did lose a starting linebacker from last season. Jalen Alderman is now in the transfer portal. Cincinnati also lost a starting linebacker yesterday. Dorian Jones has entered the transfer portal. We touched on Utah. They added Damian Alford, the Syracuse wide receiver. They also added a pretty productive edge defender from Utah State, Paul Fitzgerald, earlier this week. And Utah State lost some depth at the running back position. Devon Booth had been a quality performer for the Aggies last year. He entered the transfer portal Thursday night. Cooper Lega, who has been a starter at quarterback for Utah State, entered the transfer portal as well. He's the second Utah State transfer from last season to enter the portal this spring. That seemingly clears the way for the return of Spencer Petras at Utah State. I've heard some good reports about him coming out of Logan so far this spring. And then Bryson Barnes, haven't heard as much about the Utah transfer, but Barnes and Petras seemingly now the top two contenders to start at the quarterback position for Utah State. But Booth was the leading rusher for the Aggies last year, 805 yards and 6 touchdowns, averaged 6.7 yards per carry. So an explosive quality running back. Did split time with Rushell Fagan and Robert Briggs Jr., both of whom had over 80 carries last season. So it's not like Utah State's necessarily in a bad spot now at the running back position, but Booth had been the best of that group last year. There will be plenty of other news and notes. FAU had multiple starters on the defensive side of the ball in the past, entered the transfer portal this week. A few other names are sort of trickling out now that FAU is done with spring practice. I'm curious to see how that all lands. I would expect FAU to be one of our teams of the day next week once we have a little better handle on sort of the way that roster has shifted. Mentioned Timmy McClain leaving UCF, but also a starter, former Mississippi State wide receiver Justin Robinson was the only returning starter at that position from last year's team. The way we calculate it, 51% or more of starts. Robinson not super productive, only had a little over 300 receiving yards, but I guess haven't heard very much out of Starkville in terms of where Robinson fit into that new offense under Jeff Levy. It sounds like he will not be part of that group moving forward. All right, some spring practice, spring game notes, I should say. Indiana had its spring game last night. Jack Ankeny of Hoosiers Now and Dalton James of the Indiana Daily Student were among those who had some recaps that I read through this morning. Ohio transfer Curtis Rourke was the first team quarterback. That was as expected, but Rourke faced a tough challenge in the Indiana defense on his first 2 drives. He had 2 incompletions and an intentional grounding penalty on that first set of drives. Had some early misses, but got in a rhythm later on, finished strong according to Ankeny. Led Indiana on a touchdown drive that turned out to be the game winner. Looked good on mostly short passes, completed 8 for 7 yards or fewer on that final drive, including a 3-yard touchdown pass to Anderson Kobe, who was the leading receiver of the night for Indiana, somewhat surprisingly, but did a lot of his work, I think, against the number 2 defense. Rourke also on that final drive got Elijah Surratt, the James Madison transfer, who a lot of folks are very excited about. Hit him twice for double-digit gains on that final drive. So perhaps those two building a rapport this spring and in the spring game, sort of when the rising to the moment, I suppose. Rourke finished 21 of 33 passing for 146 yards and a touchdown. His top challenger for the quarterback position. Taven Jackson played with the second team offense. Jackson got off to quite a good start, 7 for 7 on his first drive. That included a 39-yard pass to Kobe and an 11-yard touchdown to Donovan McCulley, the 6'5" target, former quarterback transfer who head coach Kurt Cignetti got onto a little bit through the media early in spring practice, said he needed to pick it up. McCulley did have a good spring game, had a couple of big plays in the spring game. Not sure he's going to be the top wide receiver as some might have expected at the beginning of spring practice, but seems to be coming on throughout the course of this spring and perhaps responding to getting called out a little bit by his head coach in the media. Kobe and Jackson connected on a 64-yard completion as well. Wake Forest running back transfer Justice Ellison scored on the ground. He and Tyson Lawton, who transferred from James Madison, also had a rushing touchdown. Jackson finished the night 11 of 14 for 170 yards with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Kobe had 114 receiving yards and a touchdown, again, to lead the team. True freshman Tyler Cherry didn't get very much action, was in for 2 drives, completed 1 of 3 passes for 8 yards. So following, again, one of those comments from Cignetti that he's not ready seems to indicate, based on his playing time in the spring game, to be the case. This is most likely Rourke's job, but at the very least a two-man composition with Cherry, going to be a factor later on in his career. At Purdue, Tom Deinhardt of Golden Black had some follow-up thoughts on Purdue as the Boilermakers spring came to an end last week. KJ Jefferson, who had been playing an edge position last season, is an inside linebacker now, and it sounds like, according to multiple reports, a lot of what Deinhardt has said throughout the course of the spring, that the indication is that that's going to be a very good fit for Jenkins. He will play on the edge some in obvious passing situations, according to Deinhardt, who also mentioned that at the quarterback position, it was perhaps interesting to see true freshman Marcos Davila was with the number 2 offense, was, seemingly the backup quarterback to Hudson Card. And as Deinhardt said, don't want to read too much into spring games, but he had a beautiful 40-yard connection with fellow freshman Jamar Harris, who has flashed, and Davila and Ryan Brown were taking turns with the number 2 offense this spring and in the spring game specifically, and that Brown got time with the number 1 offense in the second half, but Bennett Meredith, who was the starting quarterback for Purdue when Card went down last season and started against Northwestern, got no snaps with the number 1 unit. So seemingly Meredith, not in contention maybe for that backup spot, that Brown and Davila, the true freshman, maybe is the player to beat. Deinhardt mentioned Jamal Edrin, who transferred from FAU last season, suffered a knee injury that ended his season before it would start. But the way that Deinhardt wrote it, he will be wide receiver 1 in 2024. Pretty interesting. Makes the clear statement, clear prediction that Edrin is going to be the number 1 wideout for this Purdue offense. So maybe you forgot about him after not playing last year, but definitely going to be a big addition, getting him back and healthy for the Purdue offense. He didn't play in the spring game, but seems like he is going to be Card's most likely top target. Edrin called him big physical target. And of course, as I said, didn't play on Saturday, so might have missed if you were tuning in or looking at highlights. Don't forget about Edrin again. Deinhardt also had some very positive things to say about freshman running back Jaheim Merriweather, who, quote, looks the part. Wow, you don't see 6'2" running backs that often. Fluid. He had a 40-yard TD run called back. Can he forge a role in 2024 as a true freshman? Is the question for Purdue. Tight end Max Clare was often targeted during the spring game, and seems like he is going to be in for a heavy workload after returning from injury after the first 5 games last season. And there were a lot of players who were unavailable for the spring game on Saturday, including several offensive linemen, as well as wide receiver Cam Brown. But it was interesting to me. There was also a write-up, an interview on Golden Black earlier this week that discussed Jake Butt, who was the commentator for the Big Ten Network at Purdue's spring game, who just had several glowing things to say about that Purdue offensive line. So perhaps good news there for the Boilermakers, even with that unit being limited due to injury in the spring game. At UCLA, who is one of Indiana and Purdue's Big Ten counterparts now. A few notes coming out this spring. David Woods of Bruin Report Online has been very busy in recent weeks. Alex Kirschenbaum of All Bruins also had some write-ups as well. But the biggest news, and somebody I should have mentioned prior to now, defensive lineman Jay Toa is entering the transfer portal. He put him in that group with Williams and Barrow and West, and perhaps at the top of that list as far as players who are going to get a lot of interest in the transfer portal. Toa, who Woods said is probably the top NFL prospect on the entire team. This was before he officially entered the portal on Thursday, or announced he was going to enter the portal on Thursday. And certainly the key to UCLA having a credible defense this year. Well, that now is very much in question. Woods noted earlier in the week that Ethan Garber's probably had his best day throwing the ball, and that his connection with Titus Mokiao Atamalala was working perfectly during red zone drills, with 3 touchdowns to Mokiao Atamalala in 4 plays, and that Mokiao Atamalala, for his part, quote, continues to look like one of the very best players on this offense. Getting him back this year could be critical. So there's been some question as to, what's the running back situation like at UCLA. The depth as a whole across the roster is a bit of an issue. I certainly noticed that building their team profile. Woods noted that in a piece where he offered 5 takeaways from the spring thus far. That talent is down basically across the board. Also expressed some specific concerns about the depth at tight end and linebacker. Wide receiver is a strength, especially if Mokiao Atamalala is going to step up and be a playmaker. And J. Michael Sturdivant has been limited by injury so far this year, so keep that in mind as we're reading any transfer reports. But the tight end depth, part of that is because expected starter at tight end, Hudson Habermehl, was one of 3 UCLA players who have torn an ACL so far this spring. One walk-on running back, Troy Legber. The other, a redshirt freshman defensive back, Donovan Pellet, who we had penciled in as a potential contributor backup in the secondary there. But UCLA not getting a lot of great news either on the transfer front or the injury front. Few final notes before we turn our attention to our team of the day, which is Troy at Oregon State. Nick Daschel of the Oregonian noted that Giovanni McCoy has been taking more first-team reps late this spring in the most recent practices, ahead of Ben Gulbranson, who it sounds like has been a little bit limited by injury. Both he and Jabari Johnson have missed some time due to injury, according to reports. So McCoy maybe not necessarily outplaying Gulbranson, and some of our earlier what we read earlier in the spring in that competition was that those two were pretty neck and neck. But at least as of late, McCoy is getting a little bit more work. Jamie Vinnick of CougFan.com had some notes on Washington State, something to potentially file away. Wide receiver Kyle Williams was absent from day 10 of spring practice Tuesday. And Vinnick asked head coach Jake Dickert about Williams, who seemingly, going to be the number one option, whoever ends up winning this quarterback duel between Eckhouse and John Mateer. Zevi Eckhouse, the transfer from Bryant, and John Mateer, who was last year's backup. Dickert said, quote, "We have a couple of guys that we've got to make sure academically are doing things right. Kyle is one of those guys. Rashard McKenzie is one of those guys. We've got 2 weeks left of class, and they have to be out there getting it done." So file that away. Kyle Williams, pretty high expectations, especially from a fantasy standpoint. But academics, if a guy's not eligible, not going to be able to contribute not only at Washington State, but, is he a potential transfer? I've seen some whispers of that as well. Gotta be eligible. So we'll see certainly how that all shakes out. But on the quarterback notes on Tuesday, Vinnick also noted that Chris Hudson was with the second unit, wide receiver Chris Hudson, with Zevi Eckhouse, but Eckhouse had his best practice of the spring so far, and those two, quote, linked up nicely, had a touchdown as well. The day for Bryant, he went 8 for 9 with a touchdown to Hudson and another beautiful deep fade to tight end Billy Rivery. His lone incompletion was nearly a touchdown that Leon Neal Jr. almost made a circus catch on in the back of the end zone. That, again, according to Vinnick. So there's a little bit of good news, a little bit of bad news, a little bit of shuffling. Eckhouse maybe outperforming Mateer, but perhaps against, with the second team, against the second team defense. But Mateer, if he's not going to be, as impressive, might lose a little ground on some of those first team reps. All right, now our team of the day today is Troy. The Trojans, who are coming off yet another successful season, 11-3 overall, 7-1 in Sun Belt play. But the vast majority of that team is gone. Troy, in our most recently updated returning production rankings, is dead last, 134th. They have just 26.1% of their returning production in our current adjusted calculations, which encompasses transfers both in and out. Troy has not been particularly active, at least as far as bringing in players who were getting a lot of significant playing time at their previous positions. Running back Gerald Green, probably the most productive player on the offensive side of the ball coming in. He may or may not be a factor as far as significant first team reps at running back so far this season. He had just 101 yards and 2 touchdowns on 25 carries in 6 games last year. Was at East Carolina, previously Georgia Southern, where he had a little bit more success early on in his career. But Gunnar Watson, quarterback, is gone. He threw for 3,557 yards, 27 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions last season. Goose Crowder was the backup last year, was 9 of 13 for 94 yards and 1 touchdown, so very limited opportunity in 3 games. But a former West Virginia signee, seemingly the previous coaching staff and the new coaching staff, very, very positive about Goose Crowder. Troy has not, to my knowledge, and I'll double check our information here, but has not looked to bring in somebody to challenge him at the quarterback position. So it is Goose Crowder's job. He and Tucker Kilcrease are the only 2 quarterbacks on the roster right now, the scholarship quarterbacks. So those 2 have gotten all the reps, it sounds like, and Crowder, I don't know if it's official that he is going to be the starter, but seemingly locked down that starting job so far this spring. There were some quotes from John Johnson of the Dothan Eagle from Saturday's scrimmage, who talked to Goose Crowder, who said, quote, "A couple of guys on offense made some plays. Devontae Ross, Landon Parker, Peyton Higgins. I mean, all the receivers. The line blocked great, and the backs saw it good. The defense made some plays, so happy for them too. All in all, I'm going to walk off the field with a smile on my face. So those receivers that he mentioned, also, guys who are not major factors last year. Jabre Barber has transferred out to Texas A&M. Chris Lewis, unfortunately, has been dealing with a cancer diagnosis. Deshaun Stoudemire is out of eligibility. That leaves Ross as the leading returning most experienced receiver. He had 40 catches on 61 targets last year, 428 yards and 3 touchdowns. So seemingly, and had a huge scrimmage, according to multiple reports on Saturday. Ross looks like the top wideout for Crowder at Troy this year. And of course, a name that's I've been seeing a little bit of NFL draft buzz, Kamani Vidal, who had basically every Troy career record. Last season ran for 1,652 yards, 14 touchdowns on the ground, 5.6 yards per carry. Also had some decent results as a receiver out of the backfield as well. 18 catches, 201 yards, and a touchdown. But he is moving on. So that leaves Damian Taylor as the most experienced running back coming back from last year. He is competing with Green, Jarris Williams, Jordan Lovett, Tay Meadows, Peyton Higgins, among others. It sounds like going to be a sort of deep running back group, and have some quotes on that as well, where the C word was used, committee for the Troy running back, according to coaches so far this spring. But Taylor, the most experienced guy coming back, had 67 carries, 346 yards, and a touchdown last year. Also caught 4 passes for 9 yards and a touchdown. He'll be running behind an offensive line that returns 2 full-time starters, 2 players who had 13 or more starts last season for Troy, but Troy lost 2 of its starters to the transfer portal, including Derek Graham, who transferred to Texas A&M, has since re-entered the transfer portal. Would he be maybe able to come back to Troy? That, that's just speculation on my part, but that would be certainly a boost to this offense, which, as we stated, ranks 127th right now in our adjusted offensive returning production numbers. And the defense, one of the hardest hit units in college football. Troy last season finished the year in our power ratings, in our roster strength ratings, among the highest G5 teams in the country. The amount of production that Troy was able to get on the defensive side of the ball, and a couple of those players who were so productive, so disruptive, came in as transfers from power conference teams, and so putting that initial recruiting talent, adjusting for experience and production, guys like Richard Jubinur and Javon Solomon were well over the 100 mark in our individual player ratings by the end of the year. I mean, double-digit production points year after year for those guys, combined with other experienced, defensive linemen, TJ Jackson, who's since transferred out to West Virginia, Buda Jones, AJ Pierce. That front 7 was a top 15 unit at the end of the season in our position and unit ratings nationally. Number 1 at the Sun Belt at every offensive position, according to our numbers. Top 10 defensive line, top 10 linebacker group, depending on how you throw Jibnor and Solomon into the mix. They had the best defensive line in the Sun Belt, the best secondary in the Sun Belt, and a top 15 roster strength last season. Now, 1 starter is back. Only 1 player who ranked among the top, 10 tacklers. 1 of their top 10 tacklers is back. They lost Jaden McDonald to the transfer portal. They lost a couple of guys in the secondary, Caleb Rossaw and Keyshawn Swanson, to the transfer portal, and then more than half a dozen players out of eligibility who were starters last season for Troy. So they rank 133rd in our adjusted defensive returning production numbers. This is just a brand new team. There are a lot of positive things coming out of spring practice. In addition to last week's scrimmage, Josh Boutwell from the Troy Messenger, like I said, wrote up the depth that is at running back despite losing Kamani Vidal. Head coach Gerard Parker said that they would probably be looking, like I said, to make that a committee situation. He said, quote, "They're developing trust through our coaching staff and our offense and our players in the locker room. I think that we'll attack what was lost by attacking it with a group. We'll have to do it by committee and let those guys earn the opportunity to get carries. They all bring different things. There's different talents to each of them. I think there are 4 guys coming out of spring that will be able to help us. So we'll do it by committee and attack it that way." Damian Taylor, again, the most experienced, but expect that he will be competing for carries and perhaps sharing that workload with up to 3 others as well. But looking at the schedule, can Troy get back to Sun Belt championship caliber? They beat App State for the conference title last year. The Sun Belt, to my eye, early on, before we have our official Sun Belt power ratings complete, seems pretty wide open. My best guess right now is that App State perhaps is the favorite. I think James Madison certainly in the same boat as far as lost level of production as Troy. Texas State probably the favorite in the West Division. We've talked a good bit about Texas State so far this spring, but Troy, especially if Goose Crowder comes in, solidifies that quarterback position, they're still going to be a dangerous team. I do think they are going to be a top half of the division, top half of the conference type team, despite being on the extreme low end in returning production loss. There is a pretty tough early season schedule. Troy probably will be favored at home against Nevada in week 1, but then back-to-back road trips at Memphis, who we said plenty, is probably going to be one of our highest rated G5 teams in the country. And they have to go at Iowa in week 3, so not necessarily a great matchup for an offense that is very inexperienced. They host Florida A&M, who is coming off of a Black College National Championship last season. FAMU lost a lot of key players, lost its head coach, but still a top quality FCS program. So that's going to be maybe a little bit tougher matchup than you might expect out of an FCS opponent. And then they start Sun Belt Conference play in the last weekend in September, hosting ULM. Probably will be favored in that game. Another team with a coaching change and a lot of turnover, but less talent to work with than Troy does. And then they do host Texas State. So that is a big, cross-division matchup, but getting the Bobcats at home on a Thursday night, that makes me think that's maybe not a game where Troy will be favored, especially depending on how things shake out in the first few weeks of the season. But that's a tricky spot for Texas State. Troy gets the next week off, then goes back-to-back road trips at South Alabama for that rivalry game on a Tuesday night in mid-October, and then at Arkansas State 10 or so days later. They host Coastal Carolina before taking a final off week November 9th. Their last 3 games, another back-to-back road trip. So that, I don't love how that's set up for them. But at Georgia Southern, at Louisiana, November 16th and 23rd, respectively, and then finish the season at home against Southern Miss. So Troy is a team that is going to fall quite a bit from where they were ranked in our Team Strength Power rankings at the end of last year. Just the Vidal, Watson, those wide receivers, that's going to hurt. And then the defensive side of the ball, basically they are starting over from a point where they were a top 15 team last season. They're probably going to be roster strength wise in the hundreds. So Troy is probably going to be a team where our expectations are pretty low, at least compared to what we've seen the last couple of years. And the schedule doesn't set up great. The 2 tough road games back to back in September. I think those are probably not automatic losses, but probably losses. So you're probably looking at 2-2 in non-conference play. They do draw Texas State, even though it's at home, even though it's Thursday night. The favorite from the West, or excuse me, of course they played the West. That's not a cross-division game. I messed that up, I think. No, pardon me. Troy is in the East. I moved the divisions out of my mind, so my apologies if I'm screwing things up here. But getting Texas State at home, that's going to be a good spot, but a tough draw to play that highest quality team from the West you would expect, and then back-to-back at South Alabama and Arkansas State in October, back-to-back at Georgia Southern and Louisiana in November. It's a tough matchup, and I think I don't know. I totally screwed up the division, I think, here because there's a lot more West teams on here. But my apologies for that. We'll get that all squared away on our Sun Belt Conference preview, I'm sure, once my mind's a little more up to speed. But regardless, it's a tough schedule, and it's a tough situation for Troy having to replace so many players. But still a team that, based on their level of success, even with so much changing coaching staff, players on the roster, implementing new scheme on offense and terminology, as was mentioned in that Troy Messenger piece. It's going to be tough, but Troy's still a team that I think will be quite competitive week in and week out, just based on the level of talent they do, stack up pretty well. I still expect among the Sun Belt. So that will do it for us today. Sorry to end on a little bit of a scattered note there. Got flustered forgetting what division Troy is in the Sun Belt. But regardless, good week for us, I think, getting a chance to do those Big 12 power rankings. We have our final Power 5, Power 4 now conference next week. Our goal is to get those ACC power rankings to you on Friday, and more spring games this weekend. Another packed Saturday with spring games. We'll have some reports and information, whatever we can learn and gather from across the country on our Monday show. We'll have, I'm sure, more transfer news, anything else we can get our hands on for our Monday, Wednesday, and Friday shows next week. But that's going to wrap it up for us today and this week. Thank you for tuning in live. Thank you for subscribing to the Campus to Canton YouTube channel. Thank you for giving this video a like. We very much appreciate that, and it really does help us. And then, of course, if you have become a member at campustocanton.com for as little as $2.99 per month, thank you very much for that. And if you are interested in the most in-depth information that we can offer, those team profiles are going to be available in early May to our C2C Winning Edge and all 22 tier members. Our returning production database is available now to those members at campustocanton.com. And thank you very much for those of you who are supporting us there. So have a wonderful weekend. We will be back on Monday for Good Morning College Football and C2C Winning Edge, campustocanton.com. I am Nicholas Ian Allen. Have a great day.